you, to Hazel, for the invitation, and thank you to all of our visitors from Ecuador for helping us, for inspiring this event and for framing this conversation for us. This talk is a departure from me, since I consider myself someone who is fairly well versed in the topic of social and environmental justice, but I'm not exactly an expert on politics or environmental issues in Ecuador. However, I have, over the years, had numerous conversations and engagements with colleagues in various grassroots communities in Ecuador, and that knowledge is much of the inspiration and framing for my remarks today. So building on Professor Carby's idea of theorizing from the South, from the global South, based on those conversations, I will be drawing on theories and ideas that I have been privileged to have been exposed to from both the North and the South. So in this talk, and I hope you will excuse both my ignorance and perhaps my arrogance, but I will be offering thoughts about struggles for environmental and social justice primarily in Ecuador and secondarily in the United States, and to focus on the problems that I think are inherent to any approach to social change that centers the power of the state and the presence of the state. Now, there is no question in my mind that by virtually any measure, the Constitution of the nation of Ecuador is perhaps the most inclusive and most progressive of any nation with respect to social, political, economic, cultural, and environmental rights and responsibilities. It is truly a remarkable document. And yet, we must address the intrinsic limitations of the Constitution and that which it authorizes. And I do this, again, with the understanding that both my ignorance and arrogance are at play here, and I welcome any corrections. Okay. So my story starts in 2008 and 2009 when I worked with an Ecuadorian NGO, a non-governmental organization, to co-write, to co-author a guide for community leaders who are confronting threats from mining companies, operating primarily in Global South communities. That organization is known as DECOIN, la Organización para Defensa y Conservación Ecológica de Endowed, or the organization that has defined itself as the Defense and Ecological Conservation Group. DECOIN is a group that is based in the cloud forest of northwestern Ecuador, cloud forest region there. This is a place that is home to dozens of keystone and endangered animal and plant species. These forests also protect the headwaters of numerous critical rivers and streams, and the site is also within the tropical Andes biological hotspot, which has been defined by scientists as the most biologically diverse region on planet Earth. And that also contains this little critter who was just discovered by human beings, Westerners, recently, the olinguito, described as a cross between a cat and a teddy bear. Really cute and fuzzy. Who wouldn't want to conserve this guy? But because of repeated efforts by the Ecuadorian government and foreign mining companies to extract metals from the region, which would harm this precious ecosystem and its communities, DECOIN has successfully expelled some of the world's largest mining companies from the area, including Mitsubishi Metals and Mining and Ascendant Copper Corporation. DECOIN has also successfully launched sustainable business programs as an alternative path for its community members to meet its needs. So why did DECOIN oppose large-scale mining? Well, the extraordinary damage to ecosystems and human health associated with large-scale mining operations has, of course, been documented everywhere you can shake a stick. The United States, Canada, the Arctic, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, Some of the many problems associated with large-scale mining include the compromising of public health of surrounding communities and the workforce, large-scale fish kills, the destruction of coral reefs, deforestation, water contamination, and the poisoning of farmland. And when communities have fought back against large mining companies and their sponsoring governments, the response often involves intimidation, imprisonment, harassment, torture, rape, murder, and other human rights violations. The United States, of course, is no stranger to any of this. So, few written resources exist to assist community activists in their efforts to combat these resources, these practices. So DECOIN and another non-governmental organization known as Global Response and I worked together to produce such a tool. My experience with these non-governmental organizations is as follows. I was the chair of the board of directors of Global Response, which is a project of the Indigenous Solidarity Group known as Cultural Survival. And we had for many years worked with DECOIN and the INTAG communities from our base in the United States against mining companies. And so in 2009, we produced this document, Protecting Your Community Against Mining Companies and Other Extractive Industries, a guide for community organizers. It's been translated into 7 languages, Espanol being one of them. It's also downloadable for free off of the Cultural Survival website. So the guide does what? It details how activists and residents can work to secure their communities in the face of predatory actions by transnational mining companies seeking to extract local minerals. The guide also features an in-depth discussion of common tactics that companies use to divide community loyalties, as they certainly have in Ecuador, and to encourage governments to allow access to mineral wealth, along with actual examples of how activists have challenged these practices. So the information in this guide comes from real experiences of people living in the INTAG region of northwestern Ecuador, as well as scores of other people, many, many other people across global South communities who have fought mining companies and sometimes negotiated with mining companies for better deals for extraction and for employment. The impact of this guide was immediate. Since its release, activists across North America, East and West Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere have used it in their campaigns and in their broader efforts to educate and to enlist support from residents in areas threatened by mining. But what's the broader regional political context or national political context for DECOIN's work? Well, DECOIN is part of and linked to the Campesino, the Campesino and indigenous movements in Ecuador that are actively defending their lands from state agencies and mining companies, particularly as the nation of Ecuador has so importantly sought alternatives to oil development. As recently as 2009 and 2010, as we know, anti-mining activists set up road blockades and called for nationwide strikes and protests that were, in some cases, met with police violence and repression. Campesino groups and the Indigenous Confederation, CONAE, believed that they should protest these laws because these laws would open up the nation to large-scale mining by foreign companies, and they believed it would not allow for the adequate protection of water systems, of ecosystems, and human health. One indicator of this concern is the fact that non-renewable mineral resources occupy the category of strategic sector in the new Ecuadorian constitution, meaning, according to one activist I spoke with, the government reserves the right to control all aspects of that sector. And so this underscores a limitation of the state's commitment to Sumak Kawsay and the reason why so many people feared their communities might be compromised. And for myself, as an activist and intellectual in the United States who had seen these kinds of promises made to communities again and again and broken, we had a lot to talk about, while admitting, of course, that my government, the United States government, has come nowhere close to what Ecuador's constitution has achieved. But what we have seen in the INTAG area and elsewhere in Ecuador are threats to ecosystems, company-led and in some cases government-led land invasions, police and paramilitary violence, and divisions within communities that only wish to sustain their livelihoods, or at least so they've told me. The threat of mining mobilized INTAG's communities and organizations to successfully, and they would argue, peacefully defend their communities and reject not only the mining companies, but perhaps more importantly, the model of development that they stand for. And this is why the Constitution is so important. You see that language there, but we are struggling with it, apparently. The anti-mining movement in INTAG is responsible for developing novel ways of opposing these kinds of extractive projects, including, for example, delisting the Copper Mesa Corporation, which is a Canadian mining corporation, delisting that corporation from the Toronto Stock Exchange, causing its share value to plummet, and also creating, as I mentioned earlier, community-based economic alternatives to mining. So, for example, they produce fair trade, shade-grown coffee for local use and for export. They produce hand-woven crafts such as bags, wallets, and belts made from the fibers of the cabuya plant. And they produce handmade soaps, shampoos, and other products. There is also a project underway to tap the energy of INTAG's many rivers and streams through small hydroelectric power projects. And finally, as problematic as it may be, ecotourism is developing as an important driver of the economy in the area. So again, I want to be clear that the information I'm presenting here comes from my colleagues in Ecuador, and I'm really reporting and theorizing based on those conversations. So let me talk about this question of plurinationalism and the state. The struggles associated with Decoin and Ecuador's campesino and indigenous communities lay bare, again, the limitations of state-centered approaches to social and environmental justice. Now, I do want to allow for the possibility that with this new constitution, Ecuador's government perhaps might be more of a postmodern rather than a modern state. And so perhaps many of these comments are moot or should be qualified. But on the question of plurinationalism in Ecuador, in many ways, it would appear to be not entirely dissimilar from the situation in the United States, where we have an overarching federal government and many smaller quasi-sovereign, but clearly subordinated tribal governments. The US case remains a colonial system in virtually every respect, and one marked by vast power differentials between and among these states, despite their inclusion. And it seems, if I may be so bold, that the Ecuadorian case has some parallels, particularly considering the president and the Constitution's treatment of indigenous communities as partners largely only as long as they submit to the unilateral management of strategic sectors. Documents like the Ecuadorian Constitution then present an age-old dilemma. Does the inclusion of the other, of the indigenous, of the campesino, of Afro-Ecuadorians, transform that society? Or does it have the effect of reinforcing the power of the state through what Rod Ferguson calls incorporating difference? Correa has made it clear that no community within Ecuador, including indigenous communities, has the right to demand free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to the use of non-renewable natural resources because they are deemed strategic to the national interest. Chapter 5, Article 313. This is a damning but not surprising dynamic. For his critics, President Correa appears to rule with an iron fist, but I don't think so. He represents only the kind of power that states embody and necessarily require. In fact, Chapter 4, Article 57.7 of the Constitution makes this crystal clear when it says that consultation, not consent, is required for the development of indigenous lands and other communities. This is troublesome for many indigenous communities because free, prior, and informed consent is actually a cornerstone of the agreement that Professor Blackhawk referenced earlier, the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an agreement to which Ecuador is a signatory. So, when indigenous activists and other Ecuadorians protest the state's policies, they are sometimes met with inclusion, but other times, certainly prior to 2008, they have been met with violence and repression. This is nothing new, and certainly not new or unique in Ecuador. And again, I want to point out, this predates the Constitution, so presumably we have a different situation. But the repression of dissent isn't something that states engage in occasionally. It is what states do. As Max Weber famously wrote, states, at the core of modern nation states, is this legitimacy on the legitimate use, the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. So if I take seriously the work of philosophers and scholars like David Theo Goldberg, Elizabeth Helene, Carol Pateman, Charles Mills, Maya Ramnath, Mick Smith, and many others, maybe James Scott here at Yale, if we are to take seriously the task of opposing human dominance over non-human natures, if we are to take seriously the task of opposing authoritarianism, patriarchy, and racism, then we must also accept that any engagement with states will necessarily yield limited results. So accordingly, post-statist theory in politics may be an additional way, not a substitute, but an additional way of embracing values and practices that enable us to ask not only can we grant rights to others, can we include others, but also what might our communities and our societies look like if we embraced freedom for all beings, freedom that is from inclusion into the state's ambit. I don't have much more time, but I do want to raise the question of the role of non-human natures. I think, other than being granted rights, do non-human natures actually exercise agency and enjoy autonomy in this framework? This is something I ask myself in the United States, and the answer here, of course, is no and never. I think in the nation of Ecuador, we have the beginning of the possibility of really applying the imagination, the profound insights from indigenous and campesino and other communities about human and non-human relations that can move us beyond that divide, can move us beyond a situation of dominance and hegemony, and one where, following the work of maybe theorists like Jane Bennett, we can embrace a vital materialism where we see non-human natures as not just a recipient of rights, of being granted rights, but also a participant, a collaborative agent in co-production of our society. So I want to end by just saying that as a scholar and activist who's spent 20 some odd years in environmental justice studies and the environmental justice movement, I see deep parallels and deep links and deep possibilities between the principles of Sumak, Kawsay, and environmental justice, and I look forward to a conversation about that. Muchas gracias.